Hi there, folks. Welcome to this video lesson about the rise of industry or the Industrial Revolution in the United States. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Whenever my PowerPoint feels like working. Okay, so some things we're going to go over. This is going to be a series of video lessons. So this first one, we're going to look at timelines, Jim Crow, take a look at some of those. My students have already seen a video lesson about Jim Crow. This obviously is not comprehensive. This is meant to be an overview, the big picture ticket items. But anyway, here we go. All right, today machine, today. There we go. Okay, so let's start with some timelines. So there's a couple of things. Now, do you need to memorize everything in this timeline? No, of course you don't. But there are some things that are pretty important. Number one, over here at 1869, the first transcontinental railroad is completed. That's key. Remember, folks, the single most important economic factor of the 19th century was, that's right, the railroads. So very, very important. In 1870, Rockefeller organizes the Standard Oil Company. This is going to be important later on when we start talking about trusts and getting into antitrust law and the next unit with the Progressive Era. But so I want you to keep that in mind. Rockefeller really organizes the Standard Oil Company in 1870. Let me shift my little camera guy there. All right, so then we have some inventions, right? We have Bell patent, Alexander Graham Bell patents a telephone, and then we get Edison who invents the electric light. And in 1886, trade unions form the AFL. This is going to be really, really important down the line when we talk about efforts of workers to unionize and start to kind of attack back at the terrible working conditions they have and the absolute rock bottom pay that is awful. Okay, here we go. So this is going into the 1900s a little bit. So let's talk about this for a second. So in 1890, I want to draw your attention to that. That's really important. The Sherman Antitrust Act is passed. This is the nation's first attempt to start to regulate the trusts and start to bust those trusts. And if you're like, what the heck is a trust? Don't worry, I talk about that in part 3. So we'll get to trust in a minute. Ford builds the first automobile in 1896. That's fun. And ooh, we get the first airplane. Yayness. So the Wright brothers did the airplane. And Ford actually introduces the Model T, which is going to become the most important one at this point because that's the one that regular folks can afford. So that's going to be really, really key. Okay, so here's another timeline that I made. So the ones in red are particularly important. Because they have implications for future events. So in 1871, we start with the Chicago fire. Now, this fire was horrible. About 300 people died. What makes this significant is Chicago really starts to become urban and really urbanizes and gets into a cityscape. They start building, city-style buildings. They start bringing in industry. So this transforms Chicago because of the destruction. So many things had to be rebuilt, and a lot of things were rethought before they were rebuilt. So there's that. Talked about Bell and Edison. Carnegie offers to build a library in every city. This is going to be important. We're going to talk about his document, The Gospel of Wealth, later on in these video lessons. And Carnegie decided that, I have all this money, and it's going to be, look impolite if I just hold on to it. So what can I do with this money? And one of the things he thought was important was access to knowledge, so he offered to build a library in every city. In 1885, we get the first steel frame structure built. In 1893, you have Chicago World's Fair, which is really important, and this thing called the City Beautiful movement, which we will talk about later on. We get the first American subway in 1897. Hey, for Boston. New York passes a tenement house law that was a progressive era reform. We'll get to that more into that in the next unit. New York City subway opens in 1904. In 1906, we have the San Francisco earthquake, and then, of course, in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which also ushered in several progressive era reforms for conditions for factory workers. So let's talk about Jim Crow for a minute, this awful, terrible, terrible thing that was Jim Crow. So what was Jim Crow all about? Jim Crow was the South's attempt, and just racist people's attempt generally, to disenfranchise and continue the discrimination against blacks in the post-Civil War era, or actually post-Reconstruction era. You're talking 1877 to about the 1950s, Jim Crow lasted. So that's particularly important. So what do we mean by disenfranchisement? Basically, these racist people tried to keep black people from accessing the vote, okay? And how did they do this? They engaged in assigning poll taxes, used grandfather clauses, literacy tests, residency requirements, anything they could possibly think of to keep black people from voting. This was horrible. We also have segregation. Segregation would remain the law of the land until much, much later on in the 20th century. And we also have a combination of civil rights cases. Now, the civil rights cases that I'm referring to, these were a combined 5 cases, and these all stemmed from the 1875 Civil Rights Act that was designed to give newly freed slaves rights, basic civil rights that every American should be entitled to. And what did that Civil Rights Act say? Well, it said this right there. And unfortunately, a lot of those rights were overturned by a very conservative and very discriminatory court. So the Civil Rights Act did not have the impact that people wanted it to have or that it could have had because a lot of its provisions were overturned by the Supreme Court. So that's important. So this is what the 14th Amendment says. Okay, I want to remind us of what the 14th Amendment says because black people were continually denied their rights under the 14th Amendment. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It would be until the middle of the 20th century until this amendment is finally starts to be followed. Unfortunately, Jim Crow was a protracted, horrific period of discrimination, intimidation, and racial violence that there's no excuse for. So I want you to remember what Jim Crow was and how long it lasted. It's going to persist throughout the Industrial Revolution that we're going to talk about and into the progressive era as well. Unfortunately, some of the progressives that we celebrate today weren't all that progressive when it came to racial justice. And that's important. I want us to remember that. That's important to know. So in 1896, we have Plessy v. Ferguson. That's another important part of Jim Crow. That codifies basically into law separate but equal doctrine. The fact that that blacks and whites should not travel together. They should not be in hotels together. They should not be in restaurants together. This is segregation, okay, keeping blacks and whites separate. And of course, it was separate, but it sure as heck wasn't equal. Okay, let's just put that right out there right now. So Jim Crow set the pattern of racial interaction for the next 60 years. Okay, the issue of segregation did not come back into national prominence until the 1950s, when several Supreme Court cases went before the court to try to knock this down, and civil rights activists began in earnest to try to get rid of these very, very discriminatory laws. Okay, so let's go into an overview of the era. So in the 1820s, most people were living in rural areas. A short 80 years later, you have 20% of Americans are now living in cities. So you went from the vast majority of people in rural areas and not too many in cities to a whole lot more people living in cities. And this was largely due to factory building, right? There were factory jobs there. Most immigrants arrived in cities. Think Ellis Island, which were in New York City, and Angel Island on the other coast in California. You also have the development of a growing white-collar class, and you start to see significant distinctions in culture between city dwellers and rural folk. Okay, and this is going to be important going forward. So remember that. There's a significant distinction in culture, in political life, and economic life between city dwellers and rural folks. So what is urbanization? You need to know what urbanization is. I'm telling you right now, write this definition down, memorize it. You must know what it is, okay? So the root cause is industrialism, but what is it? It's the movement of populations from rural to urban areas and the resulting increasing proportion of a population that resides in urban rather than rural areas. So this is a fancy way of saying sorry, talk too fast, that people went from rural areas and they moved to cities. And they did this in large numbers, okay? Now remember, well, maybe you don't remember, but anyway, early industry began in the countryside. There was this thing called the cottage industry where folks would make things in their homes and then go to a marketplace and try to sell their wares or simply ship their products to the people who wanted them. So early industry was in the countryside. The city was a place to buy, trade, and sell. Okay, but the actual making of the product happened in the countryside. This starts to shift during the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines removed the need for water-based power sources, and railroads connected people and businesses and industry. So factories were built to be near or next to suppliers and markets, and this is where you start to see the shift going from countryside into the urban environments, and you get this sort of stereotypical city factory base sort of existence. So cities with access to ports also influence growth. So you're looking at these cities right here with access to really good ports, those because that facilitated trade and business transactions. So these cities become major centers of industry, and this starts to happen the end of the 19th century, around the turn of the century. This starts to take shape. Here's an example of you can just pause the video and kind of take a look at this just to kind of get a sense of where natural resources were and where factories might be and where jobs might be and the types of jobs that might exist, just to give you a sense of where the country was around this time. Okay, so industrialization led to a huge demand for iron and steel, and the Americans were in a unique position to facilitate this demand, to try to offer some products up to this demand. So if you look at these three graphs, you're looking at iron, you're looking at steel, you're looking at coal, okay? And if you track from 1870 to 1900, you see what's going on with the United States. Whoa, by 1900, we were low, I mean, way low. And then by the time you get to 1900, we have skyrocketed. And you see this on all the graphs to the point where being one of the lowest, we now are the highest in production in iron, steel, and coal. So that's going to be really important for the development, the economic development, and even the social and cultural development of the United States. Take a look at those for a second, familiarize yourself with that, and just see we want to identify trends. Whenever, like if you're on any kind of standardized test, in many cases, they want you to identify trends, right? It's not so much the exact numbers that you're looking at. It's like, what can you see? What is the pattern, right? That's what you want to identify. And of course, the pattern here is the rapid industrialization of the United States, which led to us being the #1 world producer in iron, steel, and coal. Okay, so some major developments. We had a lot of technological development that came out of cities. You have this concentration of people, concentration of knowledge, and this enabled people to make connections and develop things that may not have necessarily been developed. Necessity, as it says at the top, is also the mother of invention. Now, in a city environment, you need certain things that you don't need in a rural environment. So this necessity of better transportation, of different types of buildings and agriculture, of different types of communication devices. Necessity is the mother of invention. It came to be because there was a need, and inventors were tinkering with how they could fill that need and came up with all those things. So, and many of those things we rely on today. If you're in New York City, for example, or most major cities, you need subways, for example. And mass transit is really important in urban environments to get people from A to B and to C or D or E or F, right? So that stuff is all very important. Skyscrapers made living in cities possible because it allowed for a larger concentration of people because you could build up. Because cities, of course, are concentrated population centers, and if you can't build out, okay, at some point you reach a saturation point unless you can build up, which skyscrapers allowed us to do that. Growth of cities was largely a private enterprise. In contrast to some previous innovations like the National Road, the Erie Canal, the railroads, there really wasn't very much public investment here. These were private individuals and private businesses that decided to invest in cities and do these sorts of things. So what were the key industries for the development of cities? These four, okay? There was a role for municipal governments. They had to provide some infrastructure, and they established rules and regulations. That's going to become more prominent when we get to our next unit, the Progressive Era. So remember that. So, you know, the cities can get pretty crowded and pretty gross when you have all that smoke and smog from the factories. So how can we make the city a more pleasant environment, right? So this idea of the City Beautiful movement, this creation of large park systems within cities, wide open roadways and parkways on the outskirts, and zoning laws with planned suburbs, was part of this movement to kind of make the city more palatable and a little bit closer to nature. So trying to bring the best parts of the rural environment into the city while still maintaining the city environment. So that was a huge push. This is how we got Central Park in New York City. There were a lot of ideas that were put forth at the Chicago Columbian Exposition that later became reality. So this is a big movement, and it certainly changed the way cities are laid out even today. Now, whenever you have massive economic growth and massive shifts in society and culture, politics and economics, you have battles between the various social classes and economic classes of society. So what are we looking at in the urban environment? We are looking at the urban elite, the super rich, the suburban middle class that existed in the outskirts of the city, and we're looking at the poor. Now, primarily, poor was comprised of immigrants, migrants, and blacks, okay? So the distinction between classes used to be very distinct before we get the advent of industrialization. You could tell by clothing. You could even tell how people's behavior could indicate who was who. But cities erased a lot of these differences, and it resulted in new forms of displaying one's status. Because as you get factory producing clothes, for example, they become cheaper and more accessible to your average person. So clothing is less of a marker of whether one is rich or not. It sort of erased some of that, or it mitigated some of that. So people would show off wealth in a variety of ways. They would get membership in exclusive clubs, and they would reside in very particular and exclusive neighborhoods. This unfortunately continues today, as I'm sure we all know. So let's break it down between the urban elite and the suburban middle class. So the urban elite, they were wealthy. They had centered homes in the heart of cities. Okay, so they were in the middle of everything. They could access the shows. They could access those exclusive clubs and the fancy restaurants and all that stuff. There was distinctions between old money and new money. So people who've been rich for generations versus people who were, just struck oil or something, and all of a sudden, seemingly overnight, they're now very wealthy. New York was a hotbed of the elite class. It still kind of is, if we're being honest. This resulted in the creation of financial centers, vehicles for displays of wealth, and opportunities for social recognition. So when you see the development of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Opera, and the creation of these art museums and these theaters and things like that, where people could attend and display their wealth and show how great they were, the wealthy would sponsor these things to prove their wealth. And that with your social, as you did things like that, social recognition went up. So things like that. The suburban middle class was a little bit different. They preferred to live outside the city. They were attracted to the idea of the rural ideal. The simple, idyllic, beautiful, and just wonderful countryside sort of, this idyllic view. But they still wanted the advantage of the city. So they were kind of like in between rural and urban. I'm going to show you some pictures just to kind of get a sense of what that looks like. Middle class used to be comprised of independent careers, but now industry and the rise of industry and the development of factories and various corporations resulted in salaried employees that were actually entering the middle class, so-called middle management. Their location also dictated social standing within the middle class. So a lower middle class was closer to the cities. Upper middle class was further away with larger homes and more land. We have the beginning of this thing called the suburban sprawl. What is that? Well, these are visual images. This is what urban looks like, suburban, and rural. Okay, and here's another picture. Rural, urban, suburban. Okay, just to give you a visual of what those look like. So the effects of suburban sprawl changed a lot of things. There was an emphasis on family and work. The local community was not as important. Owning your own home was important. And we start to see this super emphasis on the development of the nuclear family. Quote unquote, the husband, wife, 2.5 kids, the dog with the white picket fence, that whole stereotypical ideal of what is best. The importance of extended family members lessened. And how did this factor into division of responsibilities in and outside the home? Wife was internal, husband was external. Wife, you got to raise the kids, keep the house. Husband, you got to maintain the career, make a living, support the family. Children are both. They have to go to school, external, but then they still have to obey their parents, internal. So this is how things kind of shook out in the nuclear family setup. We do have some changes here. So we have an increase in the average marriage age. Outward, everybody's very prude and very, oh, you can't talk about this. Oh, no, the word sex is going to make people faint. Like they can't take it. But inward, and if you look at the literature of the period, there's a lot of experimentation and an actual acknowledgement of desire in women, not just men. This changes the dynamic and the relationship between men and women. So this will be important from a social cultural perspective. We also have this age of the bachelor where a lot of men remain unmarried and they're just, going to town and having a high old time and just enjoying themselves as opposed to, getting tied down by the responsibilities of marriage and family. And because of this, we have an increase in participation in competitive sports and also development of a bachelor industry. We have saloons, clubs, sporting events, like things where men will go to hang out with other men, and this is, have a good time. So key aspects of city life, we have some new inhabitants here. We have some politics, some religion, amusements, and higher culture. So in 1880, you have 6 million people. By 1900, you've got 14 million people. Okay, this is a shift, a huge shift. Okay, from going from countryside into the cities. Okay, this is what we're talking about with urbanization. Immigrants came from other nations. They represented roughly 30% of city populations on average. This is a very general number. In Boston, you had a large influx of Irish, Minneapolis, Swedish. Other northern cities got a lot of Germans. Chicago was Polish. New York had a lot of Eastern European Jews, and San Francisco had a lot of Italians. These immigrants had very little choice in their location of their residence. They basically had to go where they could afford and where they were allowed to be because, again, showcasing of wealth is partly where you live. You do get the development of immigrant institutions because these immigrants congregated in neighborhoods. And so you get newspapers in native languages, singing societies, theaters, and parades to celebrate the immigrant culture within these individual neighborhoods. And you also get the development of an urban Black culture. This is going to be really, really important when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, really, really important. Harlem Renaissance would not be possible without this era. So race and ethnicity did divide people, but politics did unite some different groups. So I need you to understand the concept of a political machine. Okay, there are 3 elements to a political machine: party bosses, election district captains, and party loyalists. These political machines ran local and regional politics for many, many years. To some degree, they still run local politics, depending on where you are. So party bosses governed the party machine and controlled politicians. Election district captains worked under the party bosses. They mobilized support at the neighborhood level. Party loyalists were people who you could guarantee they're going to vote in favor of the political machine the way that they want to go in exchange for jobs, favors, and help. Okay. These political machines, while they could get incredibly corrupt, did provide people of a lower socioeconomic status a place at the table. Religion is going to be important here. So for urban Blacks, church was the center of community activity and support. Without the churches, the urban Black culture never gets off the ground. So the churches are going to be really, really important here. In Judaism, you have 2 groups. You have the Reform and you have the Orthodox. Catholics were still different. Protestants were different from there. You guys can read this on your own. I don't need to go into each and every one, but suffice to say that a lot of people did break up based on religious affiliation, not just race and ethnicity, but also based on their religious affiliation. So Catholics did things one way, Protestants did things another, Judaism and urban Blacks did things still differently. So just keep that in mind. Amusements. Oh, look at the amusements. This is fun too. Look at the development of a gay subculture that starts to develop, and this would become more pronounced once we get into the world wars, but we'll get to that. So these are the variety of things that people can do after they've worked a hard, long day at the factory or wherever they work. So sometimes this era is also called the Gilded Age because there was a lot of high society and high culture happening. So you get the development of art museums, orchestras, libraries. There's a lot of charity. This idea was first put forth by Andrew Carnegie that it was a civic duty of the upper class to engage in charitable giving. And how much you gave to charity was indicative of how much money you had and how great you were. So giving to charity became a sort of social contest in and of itself. You also have the formation of opera companies and a variety of literary pursuits. That, folks, is the end of part one. Thank you for hanging in with me for 25 minutes. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.